really quick. In case you haven't noticed, we are in a When Worlds Collide little workshop, and we'll be talking about dual culture. So obviously this is a very important topic, and something that I think all three of us are pretty passionate about having a conversation about, because we see the struggles through the lens of the counselor. We see the struggles that some of the kids go through living in a dual culture, and then through our personal lives, we've also seen that struggle. And I think it was in Julia's Facebook page that I read, she wrote, like, dual culture is going to be the majority here soon in the United States. So it's a conversation we need to have, and we thought was really important. So we wanted to invite people to join us in this. So just to start out, to introduce ourselves, Julia, would you mind starting us off?
I'm starting.
I'll close us out.
Okay. So, which
just your introduction.
Okay. I'm Dieula Previlon. I was born in Haiti, grew up in New Jersey, and I've been in Texas for the past 15 long years. No, I'm just 15 years in Texas. And so I'm married, 21 years, 3 young adult sons. My oldest is 20, almost 21 in September. And the twins, we have twins, they're 18. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
My name is Jenny Wang. My husband's last name is spelled W-A-N-G, but we pronounce it Wang. And I was born in Canada. My parents were born in China, but they fled from China to Taiwan when they were about 4 or 5 years old. So they grew up in Taiwan. I am married to my husband Stanley. We've been married for 19 years. We have 4 kids. My youngest is 4, then I have an 8-year-old girl, those 2 are girls, and then a 10-year-old boy, and then a 13-year-old girl. And I've been practicing now since 2007.
Yes.
I'm an LPC-S, which stands for supervisor, so I help take care of some of our interns.
And I'm Sucely DeLeon, and my parents are Guatemalan, but they met here in the States. I was born here in the States, so I'm Guatemalan American. Been living in Dallas for 5.5 years. My family's in North Carolina. That's where we were since I was 12. And then moved here just to go to school. And I'm actually an LPC intern. So I graduated from UTS last May. I got my license in August. So just a short time. And then Jenny is my supervisor.
Awesome.
Here at Lifeologie. So I think before we start the discussion, I think it's important to set out some definitions so that we're all on the same page when we're having the conversation. So I think to start out, I think it's important to know what first generation means. A first generation is an immigrant who came from a different country to the country they're currently in. For our situation, we're talking about coming from a different country to the United States. Okay, that's a first generation immigrant. A second generation immigrant is the child of that first generation immigrant. Okay, so they generally were born here in the United States, but they still have some of the parents' culture. In that conversation, it's important to know that there are the in-betweens, what Julia will talk about, the 1.5 generation or the 1.5 plus generation. Those are usually children that were born in the parents' culture but came as young children and were raised here. Right? Heritage culture is the culture of the first generation immigrant. The culture that they grew up in, were raised in, and bring with them into the second, or the country that they're moving into. Okay. So dual culture then can have many definitions or many branches. Okay. People from a dual culture is someone where the first generation immigrant, and then you have a second generation child. A family with a first generation immigrant and a 1.5 plus child. Missionary families are included in this. Military families are included in this. And then you have the families that have 2 different cultures as parents. Okay, we have a lot of that in our generation. Not only you actually have that in your home, where your family's from China, right?
Yeah, well, my dad's from Hong Kong, my mom's from Taiwan.
And then your husband
Oh, you're talking. Oh yeah, my husband is from Alabama.
Yeah,
So it's a-
right. So you've got a
Yeah.
dual culture there as well. Okay. Another term that's important to understand is assimilation. Okay. Assimilation is when a minority group begins to look like the dominant culture. Okay, whatever that dominant culture is. Full assimilation is when the minority group loses their heritage culture. And there is no distinction in values or culture from the dominant culture. Okay, so there's a difference between assimilation and full assimilation as well.
By dominant culture, you mean the culture you're currently in?
Correct. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's good point. Dominant culture is the culture you're currently in, the one that dominates, the one that's more preeminent. Okay.
And question for you. I mean, I know you're going over the stuff. Do you use the word acculturation?
I would say assimilation and acculturation are probably, similar.
Interchangeable.
Well, it's a little bit different in the sense that acculturation is them being able to maintain
Right.
their culture, but then navigate in the more dominant one, but still being able to preserve.
Mhm.
So I typically use that when I kind of describe a lot of what we try to do.
Assimilation.
Yeah, because we don't really want that. We
Right.
want to fully assimilate. We want to really.
And that's possible for first and second generations. It wanes the deeper into the generations you get. So by third, fourth generation, it's hard to do acculturation.
Yeah.
So then we go on to third culture. Okay, third culture are the people that are raised in a culture other than the parents or a culture on their passport. So talking about second generation, 1.5 plus. These individuals do not fully assimilate into their surrounding culture or fully embrace the heritage culture. Okay, so it's the second generation they end up making their own culture, which we then call third culture. Okay. It's also important to know heart language. Okay, the phrase heart language is the language that you feel your emotions the most in. Okay, a lot of people who are churchgoers would say this is the culture or the language that they worship in the best. Okay, it is possible for children to grow up speaking two languages, so they will interchange in their feels, if you will, with their heart language. Okay, some people who speak both languages can feel in both languages. Okay, and then our last definition question, if you will, is how is a second generation and 1.5 plus different than first generation culture? Second generation is surrounded by their parents' culture as well as their peers' culture. Okay, their peers aren't always their same culture. Okay, sometimes they are, but not always. So both cultures are different from each other. So second generation. So second generation can struggle in finding their cultural identity, which is where we see that third culture starting to develop. Okay. So with those definitions in mind, I want us to go into a part where we each share our background culture. I think it's important to remember that all cultures are different in their stories. Okay? And even within the culture, you're going to have different stories because of maybe different regions people come out of and come into. Okay? So, Jenny, if you could start us off with what is your dual culture background?
So my dual cultural background is Chinese and American. And then you know what is my history too. So my parents came here for graduate school, and I just now am learning about like Chinese American history. So I realized that they came after like the Chinese Exclusion Act. When they finally opened the doors. But anyway, so my parents and actually my in-laws all came for graduate school to get the graduate degree, and then they decided to stay.
So I am the 1.5, which means there's I can communicate with both groups with fairly easy fluidity between the two. So I can speak French and Creole pretty okay. I can get by. And I can speak English pretty well as well. Like, many people would say, I'm African American. My parents came here in the 70s and leaving me and my 3 older sisters in Haiti for about 10 years as they were here getting their papers and things like that. And in the 80s, we followed. And so I've been navigating this dual culture thing since the 80s. I think for the most part, I'll get into it a little bit later, but it's very challenging. It was very challenging navigating. I think in some sense it's still somewhat challenging to navigate both cultures and feel at home in both cultures. So.
And my cultural background is, like I said, Guatemalan American. I fall into that 1.75 if you will. So I was born here in the United States, in New York, but when I was four, my parents decided they liked the education better in Guatemala, so we were going to go back. So I lived there from when I was 4 till I was 12. So I actually did grow up in my parents' culture, but then I was brought back here. So I had a taste of growing up in both and struggling with both. So in Guatemala, I was too American, and here I was too Latin, if you will. So that tug was everywhere I went. So the next piece we're going to talk about is if we could forgo anything about our heritage culture, what would it be? One of the things that my mom brought into with us for their culture is that in some Latin culture, women are supposed to be married by the time they're 18, 20 and start having children, and that is our point. So that is the one thing I would forgo of our culture, because there's so much more value and so many gifts, and parenting is a gift. So kind of having the choice of parenting or not, that's what I would forgo of my heritage culture. What would you ladies forgo?
Yeah, I think when we had discussed this, I was like, sometimes our greatest strength can also be our greatest weakness, whether it's us as individuals or as a culture. And I think with the Chinese culture, community and family is such a strength, but at the same time, sometimes the shame within the family can be such a weakness too, where the way that you are representative, whether you succeed or whether you fail, you're representative of the whole family. There's a lot of shame placed. I think if you talk too long, if you don't meet their expectations.
Yeah, I think for me, I would forego how patriarchal our culture, the Haitian culture is, especially in marriage. There's equality is not something you even question. You just kind of accept it in the family, that the man is. They take the head of the household to the far right. And it's oppressive, and it's demeaning, and it's limiting. And so when I got married, I've already foregone. That one's gone all the way. But when I got married, I made an intentional decision to not fall into that same category or that same trap. I saw my parents living through it. I saw people in our church living through it. Lots of domestic violence, lots of just sinful, not of God stuff that happens to women and in the family. So that's one of the many things I would forego.
I think the reason this question is important is because culture is beautiful, right? But we are human and we are broken. Therefore, our cultures can be broken. And there are things in all cultures that should end, right? At the same time, culture is beautiful, and there is beauty in it, and there are things that we should embrace and keep for our growth, for the growth of humanity. Something I have always thought is, hey, let me actually learn about this culture and see what about this culture is beautiful, so I can embrace, even though it's not part of my culture, right? So along with what could we forgo, the other question to ask is, what is something about your heritage that you love, that you want not only for you to embrace, but people around you to embrace?
That's a good question. I think how hospitable, we are in the Haitian culture. A party of 10 can easily turn into a party of 100, and we will always have enough food for everyone. When our American friends will invite us over, and they're like, so how many people are coming? Because we want to make sure we have exactly enough food for the number of people that's coming. And my husband are like, man, come on. This never happened in the Asian culture. Just come. Everybody just come. So I love the hospitality and just how communal we are. Hello, come on in. Just how communal we are. We just share everything with one another, and everyone's welcome. And we communicate that you are welcome in tangible ways. Not just, hey, you're welcome, but we go over and beyond to communicate that as well.
I love the fact that everyone's family. Like, and in the Chinese language, like, and you call everyone that's, your parents' age, uncle or auntie, right? Like everyone we're all one unit, and that community is just automatic that you feel, and the fact that we love food. I mean, right? It's kind of the same thought. Like we always have more than enough food, and we love to eat. That food is, with the 5 love languages. I think that food is another love language. That's how we share that we love you. We don't ask have you eaten yet?
That's great. I think one of the ones that I would love to keep is the loyalty or devotion that we have to each other. Sometimes it becomes unhealthy, right? Like we talked about. But Latin families are very loyal to each other. So that's something that I want to embrace that with people, be loyal to each other regardless of disagreements, maybe political disagreements or whatnot, but to see each other as humans and love each other that way. That's great. Yeah. What were some difficulties that you had living in a dual culture home?
That's a question that just not difficulties that you had that you had and continually have. I think for me, it's really navigating, feeling as if I belong in both cultures. Like you were sharing, I'm not Haitian enough when I go to Haiti because my accent gives me away, because now I speak Creole with an accent. And I'm not American enough when I'm in America, and people in America will let you know that you don't belong in certain places. Growing up, when we first moved from Haiti, I started the 5th grade. It was the most traumatic experience I have ever experienced in my entire life. And I mean, I can still feel it at times. And don't psychoanalyze me or anything. Don't tell me I need therapy. I'm still working on it. It was so traumatic, in the sense of, you can't speak the language. And, we're not dressed for the weather because we moved from the Caribbean to New Jersey. Okay? So here I am in strappy dresses and sandals and all that and bright colors and everything. And New Jersey is freezing, and we moved in September. And you have that. No one can speak your language. You can't communicate with the other children. And even growing up, I think, trying to understand what the dynamics of the U.S. culture was like, I remember questioning racial disparities very early on, when after we moved, it was just very challenging, just trying to figure out who are we and where do we belong, where do I belong in all of this. And I think it's something I continue to navigate, trying to figure out who am I in this season, and in this season, and in that season, and all of it has to do with navigating this dual culture. I think my younger siblings who were born here, I see their struggles, but my struggles and their struggles are a little bit different than mine.
Racism aside,
Mm-hmm.
because growing up, there was a lot of, I grew up in Southern California, went to high school here. I experienced a lot of racism, to the point where people would spray paint our garage door, go back to your country.
Okay, so wasn't that a trigger for you this week when our president said, go back to your country? Because I've heard that so many times growing up.
It's, we know what that means.
Yeah.
And when I was at the water fountain, drinking some water, and some kid comes to me and says, that fountain's for white people only. I'll get emotional. So I will say, racism aside, what has been difficult in navigating dual culture would be that in one culture, the Asian culture, it's about listening to authority, right? There's a hierarchy, who has authority, and as a child, you don't. You obey your parents, and then Christianity, that. But anyways, and then as an American culture, you need to stand up. You need to be vocal. You need to. That is still very difficult for me to navigate inside myself. It's still a struggle because I feel like do I speak up? Am I authority? Even now, as an LPC-S, am I authority? What right do I have for people to listen to me? So that would be a dual culture struggle that I have.
I think for me, a struggle would be an identity. Rather than being my own person, it's whose person am I? For every different person, I was a different person. For mom, I was a good Latin girl. For my teachers, I was a good not Latin girl. I got made fun of a lot for my accent when I came back to the States. I had an accent, so I forced myself to learn that current city's accent, to where wherever I move, I end up picking up the accent there and changing it. Now, unintentionally, it just happens naturally. I do that even in Spanish. Guatemalans, but when I go to Miami, I end up sounding like I'm Cuban, right? So that's how difficult it was. I always had to become the person they needed me to be. So it wasn't until my early 20s that actually got exhausting. I was like, I'm done. I'm not going to be anybody for anybody anymore. I'm just going to be me. But yeah, that was the dual culture struggle I had. If you could tell your parents something to do different in raising you, what would it be?
It's interesting seeing my parents with my kids because they're so different. They've learned a lot. My dad was reading this book, Boundaries, in Chinese. He's learning Chinese. And my son, sorry, I'm telling this long story, but it'll tell me. So my son, if he was little, he was maybe 3 or 4, and he was frustrated about something. And my dad goes, that is really frustrating. Sometimes we just need to, experience our frustration, but it's okay. I'm like, what? Doing that, I had to deal with my emotions on my own. I think very difficult emotions, and I went through a lot as a teen. My parents didn't know how to navigate that with me. So if anything, if they could do anything, it would be to validate my emotions, to talk to me about how I'm doing. Are you okay when they see me crying? Instead of kind of shutting down and be like, you're right.
Yeah. If I could tell them to do something differently, what would it be? I think for them to expect that this journey would be difficult. If they could even say that I know this is hard. Or, you know, I mean, I understand they were, you know, they had their own challenges. They were looking for work. They were dealing with racism. They were trying to find money and all of that. I understand they didn't have the emotional capacity to do this work. While at the same time, I needed comforting. You know, I think that I would ask them to be more of a comfort, um, to listen a little bit more, to pay attention a little bit more, to know that I was lonely a lot. I mean, I spent years eating lunch on my own by myself, or even I would hide behind their stairs in our middle school just to not engage with people, you know. And so I don't think they realized how hard it was. I think they just like Americans here, you know, you're here now, aren't you happy? I think in some sense they felt that, you know, we've taken you out of the war, we've taken you out of this poverty, impoverished situation. You should now be happy. I'm like, whew. And so spent a lot of time learning to deal with my, you know, angst and other emotions on my own. You know?
I think something I would tell my mom would be, you know, similar to that, just ask questions. Ask me, like you said, how are you doing? Ask me, is this difficult? Is this easy? I think the assumption, a lot of what I heard from mom was, you know English, so you should know how to do it. And knowing the language isn't enough to survive, right? So asking questions, I think the connection with them knowing how difficult it is to grow up in a different culture, to grow up with a different language, it is would have been super important to me. So why are the dynamics so difficult in a dual culture?
I think one of the things for me is that you feel pulled all the time, constantly. You know, in my family, you know, I felt like my parents wanted to preserve, you know, how Haitian we were. You know, and so they wouldn't allow us to do anything with other Americans. And so, in their preservation and fear too, they were afraid because they didn't understand the American culture, and so everything we did was like sinful. You know, we didn't participate in sports and any of that. And then you go to school, you know, and there's this other pull to be, you know, somebody else, to be American, and you're like, well, I can't do that. I can't go out for a sleepover. You know, I can't go to this party. I can't go to prom. You know, all of those things you can't do. But that pulling made the dynamics really challenging for a youngster to navigate along. You know, so.
I think for me, the difficulty in dual culture really was and is still realizing that I'm perpetually seen as a foreigner. You know, like even at DTA, even at Dallas Seminary, I remember once it was one of our classes, and this gentleman I was talking with him, like my English, like I was born and grew up here, and he's like, oh, you know, you speak really good English. I was like, like, you know, like I think he saw me a certain way, and so he expected to hear, and he did hear it that way, so I think for me, it's more of like, yeah, I kind of walk around wondering, like, how do you see me? Like, do you see me as who I am, which is I was born, I mean, Canada's close enough, right? I was born in Canada, grew up here, I went to, like, all my schooling here. Like, do you see me as one of you? Or do you see me differently?
Yeah, I think part of that heritage culture, our parents can sometimes hold on to those so strongly that it's difficult to move forward. One of the things I noticed when I went to my mom's heritage culture just recently was that they have moved forward, whereas the culture here hasn't moved forward because we want those roots to stay so strongly. So the dynamic of staying in the past and needing to be in the present and moving forward to the future makes it difficult for kids to move forward, and at times sometimes just cause rebellion as well. You know, because in my heart there was rebellion. There was this, I don't want to be that. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where I fit. So the desire to rebel was a strong one. So that made it difficult. Our last question on our background, specifically touching on heart language. We talked a little bit about heart language, and sometimes there is a disconnect between grandparents and grandchildren because sometimes they don't speak the same language. So sometimes that's a concern for us. So the question is, has there been connection within the generations regardless of language barriers in your families?
I think love is very apparent, but sharing's, I mean, our parents' English is pretty good, so they're able to share some stories, but yeah, I think sharing stories is not as much about sharing the past or sharing the stories. Yeah, that's a good question, it's hard to answer.
Yeah, I see the connection between my parents and our children. I see the love and all of that, but it's so hard for them to communicate because they don't have the language. And then, like my in-law especially, she'll make me feel bad, like shame all over again. Everything's about shame, that I did not teach the children the language of, our family. And so whenever they come around, why didn't you teach them, Creole and this and that? I'm like, well, I can't when, it's just so hard. But, she'll call and talk to them in broken English and pray with them in broken English. I can see the connection, but I can also see the disconnection because of the language. That makes it difficult.
That's good. Yeah. I think with I don't have any children, so I am single, but I have nephews and nieces, and I see the connection there with my mom. I think she speaks better English than she says she does. She understands, but she just has a hard time with it. And then my nephews don't speak English or Spanish, sorry. But they still communicate. They still understand each other. And like you said, like love, like you see it regardless of the language that they speak, that they love each other deeply.
And they know they're loved deeply.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So as therapists, we get to see some of this in our rooms, and I think it's important for us to speak in that sense as well, with our cultural background. But there's some questions that I think we need to answer as therapists in regards to dual culture. So what do you think is the fear in the first generation in regard to embracing third culture?
I think from my own experience, I think fear is definitely very subconscious, and more conscious probably is like where they just don't know how to. They don't know. They have no concept of what that is, right? What is third culture? And they're just trying to survive. Their experience of being in a different culture is very different than their children. Subconsciously, the fear is probably that who they are will be forgotten.
Yeah. Repeat the question again. I want to.
What is the fear in the first generation in regards to embracing the third culture?
Yeah, I think it's the same fear of losing who they are. I think they have a very succinct memory of like their culture and the glories of that and how beautiful it is, and how they want their children to have a similar experience, right? Not realizing we're in a different location and it's not going to happen. So they're afraid to giving into that because they just don't know.
Yeah, and I think you said too that they're in survival mode as they come here. So I think a fear of their hard work, of their what they had to do to survive, to no longer have value.
Right.
Because the children we don't have to survive in that same way that they did. So that can be seen as loss.
Right. It is a form of loss.
Absolutely, yeah. Why is it important to know that my identity is not my child's identity?
Oh, now you're getting into personal business, right? Because I struggle with that with our boys, and I struggle with letting go and allowing them to have a different experience. Like our boys are, Haitian African Americans in America, and they identify as that, and it's beautiful. I think, I never correct anyone when they call me African American, since I'm like, I just love Black is beautiful, but that's what they identify as, like, and so when they, want to do things and, dress a certain way or even have earrings or twist their hair and just different things like that, I'm like, what will my mother think? Not what will I think, but what will my mother think, Because I'm afraid of that shame. I'm like, I'm celebrating their Blackness and all of that and how they express themselves. My parents never allowed us to express ourselves or anything like that. So yeah, it's that shame thing all over again. It's it's that pull again for me as a 1.5. Like I want to embrace fully, the American culture, the Black American culture especially. But it's hard to embrace fully because I have this other culture playing out in the behind the scenes, and I'm like, well, what will my mother think if I embrace this fully? I mean, just cutting my hair in college was like controversial, because women are not supposed to cut their hair. So I'm like, but I'm, in college and I'm Black and beautiful. I want to be me. You're not an individual. So yeah.
And I think that is why it is important, because they are an individual and you are an individual as well.
Exactly.
Giving them the opportunity to live their life.
Yeah.
Because you've lived yours.
Yeah. And we've had many fights, many conversations about that, and it's really, what will my mother think, And one time I really had to confess to my son. I'm like, listen, having earrings, there's nothing sinful. I don't see anything in the Bible that says you can't. You are just beautiful as God made you. The issue I'm having is this, and I had to name it for him so he can understand. But, I've given into that stuff.
I think it builds connection. So I remember growing up, my brother was 7 years younger, and he'd be like, I'm American. And my parents like, no, you're Chinese. And I think when you're a child, what you hear is like, well, I have to stifle my Americanness. But I think if parents can understand that dual culture, that my child's identity is not the same as my identity, and it can build connection and more communication. What do you mean when you say you're American? Can you be Chinese American? What does it mean, like, to be able to build that type of
asking the questions and having them understand the cultures.
Right.
And when we were having the conversation before getting together here, one of the things that came up was honor and respect. Those two words are very big in most minority cultures. So I thought it was really important for us to make the distinction between honor and respect for our children to be able to do both properly and to be able to know when. So, what is the difference between honor and respect?
I see respect similar to validation, and validation is something that we teach a lot in counseling sessions for couples or for families. And validation means that it's not necessarily that you agree with the other person, but that you understand their viewpoint, right? That you work on understanding their point of view. And I think that the only way that respect can come is if we share stories and we can understand each other, even if you don't necessarily agree, which would be great.
I think with the answer you just gave, it's important to know that it's not only the parent that needs to be respected, right? The children need to be respected as well because they need that validation.
Haitians would say that's blasphemy.
Right. Which is why it's important to talk about that difference for parents to understand. Like, my child needs respect. They need to be heard. Their stories need to be heard. Their stories are important. They're part of who they are becoming.
Yeah, one of the things my kids often say is, everything we say to you is disrespectful. I'm like, it's because everything you say is disrespectful. But, just navigating through what is respect and what is honoring. And, we've had to sit down and talk about, I respect you and you respect me. Having that mutual respect. And for me, honor is really valuing the entirety of the human being that's in front of us, regardless of, that they're my child or I'm the parent, but it's really valuing who that you are. And because I value you, I want to respect you. And it's a mutual respect. So we practice mutual respect in the home, in our home, but we've had many conversations out of, what is respect. And I think, again, I'm defining respect from my lens, and for them, they're defining respect from their lens as an African-American Black young man, And so having that dialogue and says, when you say this, it felt like this. And we've had to have those conversations. Like, this communicated this to me when you said that, Is this what you were trying to say? No, I wasn't trying to say that. It's just that, every time we say something, you were blah, blah, blah. So we've had to have those conversations and being okay with having those conversations. Sometimes I'm like, if my parents could see how I parent our children, oh my goodness, they would be so let down. They would not be happy. But, we've had to find a third way to parent, because the way my parents parented and the way I was parented was not working for our children. So,
and I think something we can talk about was that to remember that in families there are people, and when you have people together, you're going to have explosions, right? There's going to be those moments where you're not going to agree and voices are going to get raised, and for the family to be safe enough for those moments to happen is important, right? Because we're going to have those, so emotional safety, having set those standards beforehand, set the boundaries beforehand to where you say, hey, when these things happen, this is how we're going to deal with them, right? As opposed to waiting till they happen to try to set boundaries, right? Because that usually doesn't work,
right?
Because when explosion happens, emotions are everywhere, and when you try to set a boundary when emotions are everywhere, the boundary isn't going to work, right? Yeah. So how can you tell if your heritage culture style is being harmful to your child today?
Is it being harmful to your child? I think you can tell when the children start lying, when they're not connecting with you, when there's a whole lot of silence between you all. I think you can tell when something's off, that they're not connecting. I think when you do the one-sided thing, like one-sided respect, I'm the parent, and so on and so forth. And for parents raising dual culture children, I mean, it's hard because you have to deal with your own stuff. We have our own stuff. I mean, I know I do. I'm like, this is not about my kids. This is about me. So how do I, suspend this thing that is about me and deal with it at another time and help my child where that they are? And we've had to do a lot of work in listening and paying attention because I think we came to that place where we noticed that there was that disconnect where they wouldn't tell us stuff, and they would tell me, "We won't tell you stuff because you can't handle it, and because you're always trying to, change how we think or this and that." Or they would tell us explicitly, and I'm like, "Well, I want to know what's going on, so I got to change some things." So you can tell when it's harmful. When one culture is being harmful to the kids, when they're hiding, when they're not talking, when they're not communicating, when they're isolating from you, when they're not inviting you to their games, when they're not telling you about their events at school, all those things are just like big red flags.
Absolutely agree. Lying, isolation, doing things on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So important to ask questions,
Mm-hmm.
right? To be there for them.
Because I did all that.
Yeah.
I would not tell my parents a thing about anything.
Yeah. How is structure and discipline different for my child's culture, right? Meaning that they're in two different cultures, they're going to take things, receive things differently than they would in your heritage culture. So how is structure and discipline different for them, and how can you use this for their good?
That's a hard one because I feel like my children's culture is very similar. Maybe for my parents and me. Yeah, I think for my parents, discipline was there wasn't a lot of discussion. There wasn't a lot of talking. I mean, it was basically like you did something bad and you're going to get punished for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it actually did lead to a lot of lying.
Mm-hmm.
I lied a lot growing up. I hid a lot from my parents because there was no them wanting to understand my side or the idea even in my mind back then that I was good. Like it was always about what I did wrong. And like I think our parents do the best they can with what they have, and it's not a blame thing or like I love my parents. I respect my parents. I've seen how they've grown throughout the years, but also like kind of back to our culture, like things that I would change would be that sense of like you are only told what you do wrong. You're never told what you do right. You're never praised. You're never encouraged. It's just always like you did this wrong. You didn't do this good enough. Or you compare it to other kids. So is that discipline? I guess that would be discipline.
Thank God for therapy. I mean, honest to God, if I did not do my work, I would be a horrible parent to my children. I really would, and a shameless plug, like all of you. But I would really be a danger to them because I had so much stuff going on, and I needed to let some things die. About my culture, and I needed to know my own identity because I was flailing all over the place. I didn't know who I was. I was fighting. I was trying to become who I am, and I didn't know what that looked like. And so therapy helped me a great deal to come to an acceptance of me, come to an acceptance of all of the different parts of me. I had to come to an acceptance of that. I had to heal from it. I had to forgive some things. I had to let go of some things. I had to cry about certain things, Therapy has helped me a lot. and we didn't need family therapy or anything like that. We needed me therapy. Okay, so and that's helped my children a lot. And moving away has helped too. I hated moving away, but at the same time, it gave us the freedom to try out, to allow my children the opportunity to just be without having my parents, just so hard on them about everything. I hated moving away because I missed them. So it was a double-edged sword. Like, I loved moving away and I hated it at the same time. I wanted them to be a part of the culture, but at the same time, moving away gave them the opportunity to just be and learn and embrace who they are in the American culture. So,
it's good. I think part of the structural and discipline part is that we are at different stages, right? I think I said earlier that our parents went through different struggles than we went through.
Right.
Yeah.
I think someone I heard, I think it was Lee, was talking about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're at a different place in that today than we were, our parents were. So the way they structured discipline is different than the way we would structure and have structure and discipline for our kids because of those needs. We're in a different stage.
Right.
So I think recognizing what stage our kids are in, what stage we're in, will help with that structure and discipline, because they don't need to be disciplined necessarily in the same way that kids needed to be disciplined in the 20s or in the 70s or even in 2000.
Yeah.
Like the internet.
Right. Yeah, because the internet wasn't back then. We didn't even have flip phones till college type thing. So how can I encourage my child in their new world while teaching them to appreciate our heritage culture?
I would say celebration. Like, I mean, every culture has their own celebrations, right? I think that is like one of the most fun and best ways to really embrace our culture. In the Chinese culture, we have so many festivals and things, and it's interesting because my parents, like my husband's parents, were like, we didn't want to do this with our kids growing up.
Yeah.
But now with my generation, we're doing more of these celebrations. We don't want our kids to lose them.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. We do a lot of celebrating, both cultures. The boys are like, yeah, we're 100% fully Haitian. I'm like, really? You can have the flag. That's fine. You can put the flag in your room, but be clear, So celebrating that, giving them that because I think that's their process,
right?
In knowing that they are part of something bigger, right? So I'll give you the flag, and you can learn your 2 or 3 Creole words. That's fine. Take that. But also celebrating, what's here as well, Blackness in this country, and helping them understand, who they are as well. They're at a HBCU, Historical Black College and Universities here in America, and it is the greatest thing, for them. They're like, Mom, there's Black people everywhere, and they're just celebrating, and I just love that for them, that they. And we gave them the freedom, and we've taken them to Haiti a number of times. But also, when they're watching TV, I'm like, okay, where are the different characters, that shows brown people, So we're constantly having these conversations for them to be aware that they have a duality. They have layers to themselves, and for them to be proud of those layers, both in Haiti and here.
I love that image, layers.
Yeah, I think it's important to have them be able to have the hard conversations. I think sometimes a lot of our kids try to have the hard conversations and they make absolutely no sense, so we cut them off. I think it's important to just listen to them. That's how they're processing, right? I had one client, a little Latino boy, and his conversation, the way he was speaking, sometimes didn't make sense, and Mom would cut him off. And I'm like, Mom, just listen to him. So he can process, so he can feel heard, so that he can feel part of the conversation. So I think, that's how we can encourage them. That's how we can show them that, we appreciate your heritage culture and the struggle that you're in right now, right?
Yeah.
So having conversations and listening. So what does a healthy child in a dual culture home look like?
Mm.
My kids.
Yeah.
I mean, I think everything that we just talked about, that they could be proud of their layers. I love that term.
Mm-hmm.
That they can celebrate both, holidays and festivals and other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will say that my kids have an advantage because both sets of grandparents are here. But also on the flip side, that they can talk about racism that they've experienced. That they feel free and safe to talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Freedom to move about, freedom to express, freedom to name some things, freedom to say these two things don't belong, freedom to say this hurt, and freedom to say I don't get it, So I think a healthy child in a dual culture has someone that's listening, someone that's there to kind of help them make sense of all of the different parts and the questions that they have. And sometimes they may not have questions, but for you to be the one to say, hey, let's talk about XYZ, your grandparents, from this side, from that side. And let me tell you the story, of how we came to be. But having these adults around that are helping in the shaping is what helps, a youngster become whole and figure out their identity.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think someone who is being able to be fully themselves, regardless of what place they're in, whether it's school, whether it's at home, church, wherever, where they can be able to be who they are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So as we answer this one last question we have, I'm going to go ahead and pass these out.
And then if you have some questions too,
yes, and then we'll let you guys,
dialoguing. If you have some questions,
we'll let you guys. We'll do some Q&A time. So this last question is: when does a therapist need to teach a child to protect themselves from their parents? We have, like you said, we're therapists, so we see a lot of teens, and a lot of times it doesn't just happen in culture. This just happens, period. We have to teach our client how to protect themselves from their parents. So, in the cultural context, when does that happen? When do you say, right now, I need to teach my client how to protect themselves from their parents?
I would say definitely one would be abuse. And that's actually something we have to do. When it's physical or sexual abuse, we have to report it. And so we would be doing the protecting there. But hitting or any sort of physical violence. But then also, one that we don't have to report that we do need to teach our children, our clients to protect themselves would be emotional abuse. And that is calling names. You're stupid. You're an idiot. We have to, those types of things.
Yeah, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, all of those. I've had to do it a number of times. When the parents stop listening, when the parents can't and won't help the child make sense of themselves, those are areas where I, as a therapist, have to come in and say, I need you to create a boundary. I need to teach you about boundaries on how to protect yourself, especially when, the parents are unable to help, the child develop healthy identity, and when they're telling false things, lies about their culture, and just, that's a lie. And they'll come into counseling and say, well, my parents said, all Black people, well, that's a lie. You need a boundary,
Yeah.
you know. So it's just different things like that. All of what Jenny said,
Yeah.
including.
I think. Go ahead.
And one thing, part of that protecting that is also for us as therapists, we recognize that a lot of it comes from trauma for the parents, right? From where the parents have come from, there's trauma there that they have healed from. So sometimes part of that protecting is inviting the parents into therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some of the areas where I've had to teach my kids how to protect themselves is when the kids actually being the adult.
That's a good one.
With a lot of cultures, the kid has to, because of the language, the child is the one making the phone calls, making the hard phone calls, decisions, and things that the parents are the ones that should be doing these things. So teaching the kids how to protect themselves in those situations. Those are the questions that we came up with as far as the culture, but I know there's a ton of other questions. So I'm going to give you guys the freedom to ask questions, knowing that we weren't prepped for the questions, but we're willing to dialogue them. So are there any questions that you all have as you hear us talking about these different topics? And it could be anything. You could ask us questions about our backgrounds if you want to. Or,
So I have tons, but I was trying to wait.
Yeah, ask.
Please ask.
First, I just want to honor you all and just say thank you, because I think about it's the reason why I do the work that I do. It really is.
Yeah.
Like when I had this idea to bring mental health to the after school program, people thought I was absolutely nuts. And then when I hear you talk about just the struggles you had, and some of you all didn't necessarily come from refugee backgrounds and the same type of trauma,
Right.
but because my babies come from white trauma and abuse, and then dealing with the duality, and then dealing with America, I said we have to do something. And I think it has been so hard to try to just advocate because we're not having stuff like this. So, I mean, I'm definitely going to invite you guys. I just have an idea that's boiling in my head, but we'll talk about it later. But I think, so I have several, but anyway, thinking about you and your boys and how, first, just thank you for just giving them the space and freedom to actually embrace being African American. Because most cultures, typically from Black immigrant type of environments, typically are very standoffish with embracing that they're African American. So, no, I'm Haitian. No, I'm Jamaican. No, this. And so, like, how was that? How did you have that conversation, or what got you all to a place where you were comfortable with them being able to embrace being African American, because you knew no matter what country they came from or their history came from, that they would still be seen as African American, and you know, and just being able, because I know so many folks, so many Asians who really don't embrace this whole like African American piece, and so to hear you say that they're Haitian African American, it's like, I just never heard that before. Because I mean, I'm around friends who literally put African, like you don't take advantage of being, American and all of this stuff. So I won't go into that, but just that is a question I have.
First of all, immigrants are messed up when it comes to navigating, just all of this, because we're so good at assimilating. We're just so good at just being PC model citizens and all of that. We tout, our heritage, culture of heritage, as if it's above those that live here, were born here. So we're kind of messed up. So I apologize for people of my heritage. I think for me, my first real act of racism that I was aware of in America really changed my perspective on helped me embrace my Haitianness, but also my Blackness here in America, and how people saw me, So if people see me this way, they see me as an African American, how will they see my children? And how will my children identify? And how crucial it is for my children to be able to identify as that for their own safety, for their own protection, because they need to learn how to be safe in a country like this, having this skin color. So I have to lean into my African Americans to teach us how to be Black in this country, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so my Black girlfriends and, and guy friends and people, and it's research that I've done, have been a huge help to us and our family in teaching us how to be Black in America. Because we don't know how to be Black in America. We know how to be Black in the Caribbean, which is completely different. But to give my children that was a gift. It was for their safety. It was for their protection that I needed to teach them how to be Black in America. It was lots of conversations. I think leaving our culture, our Haitian culture in New Jersey and moving to Texas was a big part of that, because I did not have the Haitian culture informing, who we were solely. We have layers, but if we were closer, I think it would have been harder to accept that we were also, African Americans in this country, or we were seen as such. So, yeah. 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 I'm really trying to pace yourself.
I am. So one of the other pieces was that the abuse piece. Like, I feel like we need more voices out there talking about domestic violence and abuse from the various cultures. And I guess when you practice and working with people with the duality of cultures, like, how do you really? Because one of the problems that we have is because we know cultures are so different, especially when it comes to like spanking and discipline. Mm-hmm. One of the things we have to do is report when we find out kids are getting, spanked and things like that. And then, I grew up in an African American household and got spanked because that's just how we rolled. And so it's just trying to, like navigate, like, that there's abuse, but then that there's like discipline. And then at the same time, because of the machismo, like just so many various cultures, like dealing with that. And how do you, how do you try to have respect for the culture? But because you want to build that trust. Right. But then at the same time, you got to report, and then CPS is kind of crazy, and so just all these different things that kind of go in it. And I guess, how do you all navigate that when you're dealing with cases? Like, are you just like black and white? Or like how do you navigate that as therapists when you're dealing with, like, when culturally, like spanking, for example, is like acceptable-ish and that type of thing, or because domestic violence is unacceptable on any level, but at the same time, that most times women aren't financially stable, and then there's not necessarily systems in place. Like, you can say, well, hey, get out and go do this, but there's a waiting list and all these things. So it's like, how do you help to, like, have you had to deal with that type of navigation as it deals with abuse and reporting and all that things?
I think for me, the little bit I've done has developed into parent education, and me asking the parents a lot of questions, a lot of why questions, like, what is the purpose of? So kind of going that direction when I hear that there might be where discipline is happening that is misconstrued as abuse, or it is actually abuse, right? I think that's the direction I would generally go is, okay, we bring the parents in and let's talk about education. Let's see what's happening, how they're understanding discipline.
So you don't just automatically, like, because I know sometimes what my staff will do is if they find out that the kid's been spanked or something like that, they automatically say, okay, we have a report. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, and so I kind of struggle with that because I'm like, I don't want us to, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want.
Yeah, I worked in a school for a few years, and 98% of the people I worked with were either refugees or immigrants, right? I think it depends on first of all, spanking, is not necessarily, a direct call to CPS, It depends on what kind of spanking. And I've had to talk to people from CPS. If there's no marks and and it's in the bottom and something like that, that's not necessarily a CPS call because they're just going to file it. Sexual abuse is a zero tolerance policy. Physical abuse to the point where the child is coming to school, with physical signs, or they're not walking well, or they're in pain and things like that. That's over and beyond just a regular normal spanking in the behind. But yes, outside of those things, yes, lots of parent education. We did hold some parenting classes to teach about some of those things because, yeah, a lot of things are acceptable in those cultures. And this is what we do. This is how we discipline. And we're like, no, you can't do that. A, it's a crime against humanity. You don't treat any human person that way. And B, it's against the law here. Okay, so we've had to do some parenting education to teach them about those things. But there are some things there that you have to call CPS about. And they're spanking, I don't use a black and white rule for spanking.
I don't typically, I think maybe because I'm in private practice, and the kids that I see are older, like older teens, or young adults. Like I don't typically see a lot of that. But I would say probably for me, if there is, physical discipline, if I'm seeing that there's anxiety, depression, I'd probably kind of dig deeper into that with my client.
Yeah, and I've had to have family meetings with those families at times. Like a kid will run away, for example, because the parents can't understand them. A therapist that doesn't fully understand that culturally there are some dynamics going on that, the parents feel disrespected, they feel dishonored, and so on and so forth. And they told the child to get out, and the child got out, and it's a runaway. And so for me, I'm like, okay, we need to come together as a family. And so I've had to do family sessions where I'm mediating between, the children and the parents, and trying to understand the cultural dynamics at play and how the parents are feeling, and feel it out, feel out what exactly is going on. But the more you understand the community, the more you understand the context of that family, the more good you are able to do with that family and for that child as well.
So, yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think a key aspect of it is understanding the community.
Yeah.
I think it's very important, to understand the cultures around us. A lot of times we want to be understood, which is good. We need to be understood, but it's important to understand others as well. So understanding what their context is,
right,
what their culture is, to be able to help them best within it, as opposed to having them assimilate fully to our culture because that's how we do it. That's what's right.
Right.
So I think it's important for us to be able to do that as well.
Yeah, I think my parents would definitely benefit from like a parenting class to teach them about the culture that they're living in now. This is what this means. I mean, when my oldest was going to like a homecoming, I didn't do homecoming when I was growing up. So I called the counselor. I'm like, okay, homecoming. My son wants to go. What is this about? So just having someone to help them navigate through, these different cultures.
I think culturally there's even difference, not just between whether to spank or not, but also what age is still appropriate to be spanked.
Culturally or American?
Yeah, in some culture, I would imagine, even their 32-year-old might get spanked.
Oh, yeah.
I know, by law, if they are minor, then, there's a question of whether it's abuse or not.
Yeah.
Okay. But, like a 13-year-old who might be, even taller than the parents now, is still consider, do we still consider that potential abuse or what did you?
What was the
age?
question?
Like
The age
if you
you're
spank
appropriate.
someone
Age
who's like 13,
appropriate,
yeah.
what's age appropriate, what's, when do you stop
When do you
spanking
stop thinking?
a child? When is a child too old for that type of discipline?
I mean, there's not.
I think more along the lines of it's just not effective. Like, why are you still
Right,
spanking
yeah.
a 13-year-old? But I mean, so, but in
I think
terms
that
of like,
would be-
in terms of, I mean, most likely what I would do is I would probably talk to the parents. Like, I don't think I would necessarily report it, but I would talk to the parents.
Yeah.
Be like, what is going on? Like, this is not that I would say that.
Right. I think that's
Because
usually
we know it's not effective anymore,
Yeah,
right?
right,
It's
exactly.
but they continue to do
Right,
that.
so that would be a parent
parent education
session. Yeah.
Well, it's a parent education session where you're trying to understand the context of the parents, because again, the cultural pulls, because in the culture of origin, the way to discipline is corporal punishment, right? And if you're not spanking, the other families around you shame you, okay?
Right.
Like my son got into a car accident or something like that. That was his fault, and he was in his teens. And someone in my culture said, "You need to beat him. It's because you're not beating him. That's the problem." So there are these cultural, pressures,
Right.
to continue to do things the way the culture asks you to. Yeah. So it's dynamic.
Difficult.
It's difficult, but some parents' education.
Yes.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but just listening to what you're sharing, I grew up overseas. My parents were missionaries in a South American country. And so I guess I'm just thinking about developmentally. I mean, and I was there and here in the States and back and forth. And it really wasn't until I would say my biggest time of struggle was when I was a young parent. When I was a mom of young kids, and things that came up, I won't get into the whole story, but things that came up for me that were huge, that I had to struggle with my cultural stuff and stuff from missionary culture stuff. And then I have a daughter who's Chinese, and it's just interesting to me. I mean, there's times where I thought, oh, I want her to embrace this more or that more. And we've had her since she was 9 months, so she's been here. And she just went back to China for a visit with her father recently, which I was like, oh, I just had these expectations of what it would be. But I guess what I'm saying is she's got to define her own journey and her story. And
with your help.
There's, yes. And there's been times where it seems like she's just, peachy keen, everything's great. But as a teenager right now, she's been struggling the last several years. And I think there will be ebbs and flows of that processing.
And that'll happen when she's in her 30s.
And it's so interesting because a lot of things don't come up until we're parents. Right? Because it was in our childhood.
Right.
And so then now that we're parents, those things come up because we see it subconsciously, implicit memory in our own kids.
Yeah.
So one more question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I don't know if there is an answer to this one, but I work in a school, and I'm curious if you have any recommendations or resources on how to work with the kids themselves. I had an instance of I don't know if it started off as bullying, but it ended up as bullying, and I usually want to see both people. And it's like, how do you help the dominant culture understand where this person is coming from, but also helping the child of the immigrant, understand, you're in a different place, it's not the same, but especially given that they go back to their home every day, it's a really tough transition. So I'm just trying to figure out how to talk to each side to kind of, if there is a reconciliation or I don't know.
Like people from the American culture, helping them understand, the immigrant children,
Right, so-
and vice versa.
They're middle school kids, right? So
Mhm.
using the kind of language that they would understand or would connect with them, getting them to understand like this person is coming from a different culture, but also the person from the outside culture was very like, you know, like very direct and very abrupt, and so it was,
yeah,
you know,
time. You
Yeah.
know, you need time for that to for that lesson to sink in, you know, because and consistency communicating that, because again, you know, we know what we know, you
Right.
know, we know what we've experienced, and so
yeah.
that child's experience is that this is how things are supposed to be. You know, whenever my parents still come around, they're like, "This is how things are supposed to be." I'm like, "No, that's not how things are supposed to be. This is how you think things are supposed to be." But that takes time and consistency to communicate that you're in a different place, and there are different rules, and they can understand that too, because when they go on in the playground, you know, playing by certain rules, they don't use those same rules in the classroom. So you can use different examples that in different locations are different rules. You know, there are different norms that govern different contexts. You know, when you're in this place, aren't there rules here? Compared to when you're in this place, there are some rules here too. And the same thing about where you're coming from. You know, you live by certain rules, but these people live by different rules. How do you continue to embrace the rules that you grew up in, but at the same time respecting and honoring this other culture as well? But it's time and consistency.
And I think in each other's presence.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So that they can get to know the other person's culture.
Yeah, good luck with mediations. Those were hard.
That is, oh yeah, like the way that you described it, I'm like, that's exactly what you need to say to them.
Yeah.
But it's hard. Like I don't know any resources off the top of my head.
No, she was just very. She was like, I did research, and it says when you're like, when you're empathetic or when you're like that's weakness, and this is not how you do it. And I was like, oh well, how do I argue with research?
I know.
It's not correct research. You don't look at Brené Brown.
Right. Exactly. I'm the expert.
It'll just take time and experience, and I think like you can't save them, right? They have to go through it.
Yeah. Well, and if there's someone who is a researcher, you could give her the words that are, you know, are good, and have her go research them. Like saying, go research empathy.
Right.
Go research kind, you know,
and that,
so that they're doing the research and the learning.
Right. Themselves.
And that rigidity is coming from somewhere too, you know.
Right.
A youngster doesn't just wake up one day and is that rigid.
Right.
So
Well,
it's
yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of research that has shown that kids, you know, those of us who come from trauma, right, our brains are different. You know, be high alert for anxiety and will look like ADHD. I mean, the processing.
Yeah.
I don't know if she has.
Yeah. So thank you all for being here with us and
Yeah.
entering in this very difficult and heart-wrenching, vulnerable conversation.
Yeah.
I hope it has been helpful to you guys.
And we're always a resource for you guys.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, I think our emails, everything are on the website. If you need to contact us.
And I will say there are layers everywhere. You know, when you're we focused our conversation on immigrants and you know and all of that, but there are layers everywhere. My nephews have German and have Haitian, and so it's like okay, layers, lots of different layers, and so. I hope the conversation, in the conversation, you are able to see your story and you are able to take something in about your own story as well.
And do follow us on Facebook. We have this once a month. I mean, different topics every month, but we're always open to, like, if you guys have a suggestion, we're open to talking about it and working with that.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for being here.